Hello, everyone. Russ of Aquarimax here. How's everybody doing? All right. Nice. We've got a lot of people in the house here. We had a little bit of a time confusion. It was just a scheduling issue a little bit, and it's not a big deal, but Dian will be here in just a minute, and we'll get ready to go. But I just thought I'd welcome you all to the stream and reassure you that we are actually doing the show, despite our slight confusion there with the time. Not a big deal, hopefully. And I'm excited to see you all. Lots of people in the chat already. We already got quite a few likes on the video, and you haven't even seen any of it yet, so nice. Looks like we've got 17 people here in the stream already. And that is great. I'm really excited for this stream too. Dian has some great stuff going on, and it's been, I don't know, probably about 2 months or so since I invited him to do this, and he seemed excited about it, and so am I. So let's see. J-Man, nice to see you here. Chris the Mad Aquarist, Tip Top Taylor, Formal Top Hat, Frank the Tank, Poseidon, Joseph Tavares, Ocean Dizzle, Heather Jensen, Eileen O'Donnell, Nezogaster, Gemma. Lots of people in your house now. Nice. So am I in front of the wallpaper or green screen? This is neither, actually. This is a fabric background that is hanging in my kitchen. I hang it from the ceiling when I'm doing this sort of live stream. I have another identical background downstairs that's permanently on the wall that I use for my other videos. But when I'm doing a live stream, because I need a good connection, I use my desktop computer. So that's what's behind me right now. Let's see. And Joseph Tavares, I said your name right. Awesome. And Tip Top Taylor. Oh, I didn't know you were in Canada too. Yeah, it's fun that we get to see. Okay, this might be him messaging me. Okay. Just a second. I'm connecting with Dian here. And let's see. Okay, 1 second, everybody. I made a little bit of a mistake, but I will be right with you. Here we go. Okay, sorry. Just having a few little issues here with the tech. I don't know. Today I seem to be. It's a Monday, but it's a Tuesday. But I'm acting like it's a Monday. I'm just kind of screwing up today. So there we go. Let's see. And Joseph, a video is coming up on powder blues for sure. Let's see. Powder blue on my floor a few minutes ago must have come from outside. Could be. All right. Oh, and we've got 32 people in. Here we go. All right. So any second now. Let's see, who else is in? Francisco Leon, Logan Cook, Albatross Gaming, Ken Malinsky. Got a lot of people in here, 34 so far. Powder blues are a pretty common one to find in several parts of the United States. They exist in a lot of the states, so that is awesome. Ocean Dizzle, awesome. Let's see. Oh, here he comes. Here comes Dian. Here we go. I'm going to add you to the stream.
Hello.
Hey, hello. Sorry about the time mess up.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I should have, I probably should have looked into that myself as well.
But that's cool because all's well that ends well. We're both here. And welcome.
Thank you.
You sound great and you look great. I think everything's
you.
working well. So
hopefully.
Yeah. This is good. So for some reason, I was just telling everybody that today I'm having Monday luck, even though it's Tuesday, in like the technology. I don't know what I did today to deserve that, but now we're all good.
You know, I think every day just seems to be a bit of a blur right now because when you said it's Tuesday, I thought it was Monday for a sec. Oh, yeah. No, I'm glad everything's working. I apologize. You know, I kind of just went, okay, 8:30, and I should have thought to myself, no, wait, that'd be 7:30 my time, but it worked out. Yeah,
it worked out just fine. So now we're here, and everybody's been really excited for this.
Oh, so, likewise.
Yeah, I've been really excited for it. I was telling everybody it's been probably a couple months since I approached you about this, and just been excited ever since.
You know, yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. I've actually been a big fan of your channel for quite some time, especially when it comes to the Isopod content. Funny enough, you know, a lot of my viewers are like, oh, it's so great you make Isopod content, but you were always the person I looked up to and I was going to get my YouTube information about Isopods. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. That's great to hear. I remember you mentioned that when we were talking a little bit. I think that's so cool. I love it when somebody tells me that I had a hand in bringing you to the Isopod side.
Oh, no, absolutely. Like, I think if I think about it, like I think a few years ago, I never really kept anything other than maybe Porcellio scaber and some Armadillidium vulgare that I'd find in my yard. And as soon as I sort of decided to dip my toes into the slippery slope of everything else, I started looking on YouTube. And yeah, like I think your channel and maybe Afro Herb Keeper, a few people. There are very few people. And yeah, like it was great content. And here we are.
Thank you, and it's very exciting to see that there's so many people in the chat that are excited about this. So this is great.
I'm glad.
So
I'm actually just trying to organize my windows. Pardon me, I didn't mean to interrupt. To make sure I can see the chat because our little stream here is ahead of the YouTube one. So I'm just trying to have it set up that I can see both. Perfect.
Right. So I had a couple of questions for you. Just for those of you, I mean, a lot of the people here watch you already, but there may be some people who are being introduced to your channel right now. So can you kind of tell them kind of what you're up to in terms of, we know you keep isopods and you've got a lot of them. What else do you keep?
For sure. So hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. And it's a pleasure to be here on Russ's channel. And so I guess I'll start by saying I'm a specialty petter, exotic animal enthusiast. I've been keeping pets for quite some time, like since I was 9 years old. And currently, I believe I have 35 cultures of isopods. Some are the same species and different like morphs or phenotypes. I have 36 lizards. They range anywhere from green tree monitors, the Shinisaurus crocodilius, the Chinese crocodile lizard, some crested geckos, lychees, the leaf-tailed geckos. I don't know if I just said that, but the satanic leaf-tailed geckos, I have 17 frogs. Most of them are dendrobates, like dart frogs, and a lot of tarantulas and scorpions. I really like the invertebrates, arachnids, obviously, but yeah, and then isopods are fantastic as well. So I guess my channel is just kind of, I try to keep a very humble learning perspective in the way I go about presenting my content. I don't like to preach. I like to share my experience as a hobbyist, kind of like very humbly and as a learning experience. And I think the thing I love about YouTube is you create this community where there's an opportunity to teach, but to learn as well. And if you go about it that way, it's just so rewarding. So yeah, I may have digressed a bit there, but that's kind of me. So yeah.
Oh, I love that, actually. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think too, that's one of the pluses about this hobby. I think there are a lot of people who have that attitude, and we need to continue to foster it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like any of us can learn from anybody else. Someone
100%.
who's been keeping isopods or reptiles or whatever for 6 months can teach someone who's been doing it for 6 years, and vice versa. It's cool.
Yeah. And the other thing is, we never stop learning, right? Everything's always changing, and we find new ways to do it better. And that's the exciting part too. Like, it's important not to hold on too strongly to ways that work, because there may sooner than later be a way that do it that works even better than that.
Exactly. I feel like if we're not learning from the people we're teaching, we're doing it wrong. Right?
That's a good quote. That's fantastic.
Well, that's really cool. I've seen quite a few of your creatures on your videos. I love it when you do like the silkworm feedings, and you get to see a big like cross section of all the creatures and how they react. And
yeah. that was a funny thing. Yeah, like I know I have a few friends, like you may be familiar with Tarantula Cat. Like, she did the hornworm as like a gummy worm feeding video, and I thought, like, the local shop here gets these silkworms often, so I thought I'd try something similar with those, because as you may know, they have an incredible calcium to phosphorus ratio, and they're actually, if I'm not mistaken, the most or one of the most healthy feeder insects that you can offer to your animal. So I thought I'd kind of do like a spin-off of just a regular feeding video and offer them to the collection. And then that kind of led to having one pupate, and then we had this whole thing with someone suggesting to call it a sky puppy, and we all know how that snowballed. And I saw that you produced a few yourself recently, which is pretty cool. Yeah. But they're really interesting animals. Yeah, they are. I'm trying to get the eggs. That's the stage I'm waiting for now. I've produced, I think, probably about 8 or 9 adults. Oh, that's awesome.
I think 3 of them might be females. One just eclosed today, and I'm hoping, there've been a lot of mating going on, but so far no eggs, but they've only been out for a week or so. So hopefully I'll get some eggs soon.
A week is a long time for them, right?
Yeah, it is. And some of them have died already without producing anything, but there are several that are still alive and mating, so hopefully we'll get something going on. That
could be fantastic. Yeah, I'm not sure what it is. It's funny, these things always happen that way. Either you're looking for something, you don't find it till you're not looking. But for me, I produced that one, and I was having fairly straightforward time rearing them. And now that I'm actually trying to do it systematically, they keep dying on me. I find that I know they're prone to bacterial infections and bruising if you touch them and pull them off like egg carton or paper towel. But lately, I've gotten a few now to finally pupate, but I don't know what I was doing wrong. I don't think I was keeping them too hot, and I was trying to keep them super clean and wear gloves. But a few of them just kept dying on me. I'm not sure what that was about, but hopefully I can get to the same point you're at. That'd be nice.
Well, if I can get eggs, I'll be excited, but I don't know how that's going to go. We'll see. Hopefully we'll both get them going, and they seem, like you're saying, such a great feeder. My leopard gecko loves them. My jumping spiders love them.
Very cool. Because if you're raising them. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Just go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I guess if you're raising them, you'll have all sorts of sizes too, right? So they can have them applicable size for an animal that tiny.
Yeah, I was figuring even my morning geckos could take the real small ones. Why not?
Yeah.
So I think we've got some questions from my patrons, Patreon.
For sure.
And then we'll start doing some questions from the chat after we get there. And sorry about the phone. Sorry, I wish the phone were not here.
Oh, that's all right.
But, okay, so Drew is one of my patrons who had a couple of questions. He said, one is, he has a friend who's concerned about raising non-native isopods because they might pose a problem to the environment in the area. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think non-native isopods can be a problem?
I have to be careful how I answer this. First and foremost, hi Drew. Also, I should say, I think that with any type of exotic or specialty pet that's not native, it entails a certain level of responsibility, and obviously you need to be mature and like with tetrivores like that are pretty hardy for the most part. Like you need to exercise caution and obviously maturity when keeping them. So I don't know what situation you'd be in where you'd potentially let them into the wild, but let's say you were thinking of changing the substrate in your isopod culture. You shouldn't just let's say, I know people that might think to put it in their vegetable garden or something. That would be a pretty bad idea with an isopod culture. Maybe you have monkai or something in there and they can get into the environment and that could pose a threat. Because if I'm being brutally honest, I think that some species, are definitely capable of becoming an invasive species. Half the species we have that are native here are actually European species. At least I can say for Canada. We have a lot of species that have, come here from overseas and are here. So, yeah, you have to kind of be careful. I think a lot of them, I'm sure unless it depends what state. I keep thinking just for Canada. I'm sure Cubaris and things aren't going to just take to settle into Ontario, Canada with the -2 weather. But, a lot of these, maybe even some of the Spanish species and the European, a lot of the European Porceo, they see -degree temperature. If they can get insulated enough below frost line or deep mulch or something, I don't see why they couldn't. So definitely, if you're thinking of disposing of hardscape or wood or anything, repurposing it, and there's a chance it could get outside, I would suggest freezing it for a lengthy period of time or something like that to prevent boiling. If you have that gut feeling that there's a risk, you're obviously doing something that you might be putting yourself in that situation or releasing something. So just exercise caution. But I do think that it's possible. So yeah, you have to be mature and responsible with those kinds of invertebrates.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think, and I know that the laws in Canada are different regarding invertebrates than they are in the US. But the law that I'm supposed to follow according to my permits, or that if I'm disposing of anything, just like you said, I'm supposed to freeze it for 72 hours. So whenever I do substrate maintenance, I sift through my substrate, try to pull every single isopod out. I know I'm not always going to get all of them. And so then I put the bag, whatever's left, once I've dealt with it. And a lot of times I'll let it sit and try to get the isopods out over a period of time, keep one side moist and whatnot. See if I can encourage any more to come out. And then I'll put that bag in the freezer for 72 hours. And then I know it's okay.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. Because you have to be careful of that. Same thing goes for phasmids and things like that are so prolific. They're producing tons of ovum, which is eggs, for anyone that might want to know. And, or ova, plural ovum, right? No, I'm trying to think.
Ova, plural, singular is ovum and plural is ovum.
Yes, my bad, backwards. But yeah, you really have to be careful, because I find invertebrates in particular, while some are fragile because they've evolved in such a particular way, a lot of them are very hardy and can adapt to different environments. So you have to watch for that, I think, especially the prolific guys.
Yeah. And so many of the isopods, like Chris, the Mad Aquarist, was saying, there's so many isopods that we have that, and you were saying too, a lot of them, most of the isopods in the hobby are not from the US or Canada. They're here from Europe and other places. There are a few that are fairly poorly known that are from the U.S. that live here naturally, but most of them a hobby are not, but they're still naturalized here in the U.S. and Canada. So that is something to think about. Now, what about this? Have you noticed? This is another question from Patreon from Drew. He's wondering how well isopods regulate their populations based on available food and space. What has your experience? What has your experience been with that?
Sure. I can't say I've never had a case where I don't want to use the word neglect, but notice that, let's say, population in one of my tubs or bins went through their food faster than expected. I think that they can resort to a bit of cannibalism. I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. Is it that, like, what would they do as a population when, like, resources are less abundant and they're just kind of how they stay alive until they're dwindling, sort of thing? Or
it looks like he's saying he said he's convincing himself that I keep needing to make myself more enclosures so that they don't get overcrowded, but eventually with the exponential growth that's going to cause, I'm not sure what to do. So do I need to keep doing that, or will they regulate themselves?
Yeah, I think it helps a lot to. It's a tricky one because you have to also just look at the animal, like, in its natural environment. It isn't confined to too small of a space. So I feel like isopods have sort of evolved to just keep reproducing for the purpose of breaking down organic material. So when they're confined to a small space, there's a few things that happen. One, if it's like a large Spanish species comes to mind, some of the males or the animals are territorial. So in the confined space with an increased population size, you're going to see more of that, which can lead to, I find, more than anything, weirdly, females being killed by males. At least for the Hoffman Segi, I don't know if that's been your experience. I've found that a lot of the females get killed by the males sometimes if there's too many in a confined space. So increasing surface area and things like that kind of gives each male its own area to be. And obviously you don't have those restrictions in the wild in most cases. I mean, obviously with a large population, if the food is there, they're just going to keep breeding. I don't find that they can regulate. I've even heard of horror stories where the animals produce so much, I guess, carbon dioxide or gas, the gas exchange was so sufficient that they suffocated themselves because they just kept booming, and the keeper was complaining that they didn't know what happened. The whole culture collapsed, and the cause seemed to be, the conclusion was that the animals got to a population that was so high with such a limited amount of ventilation that they killed themselves. So I don't even think, like, if that were the case, that they could do that, they would slowly kind of, they'd reach that max, sustainable max, right? But they didn't even do that. They just kept going and going. So I feel like, although I'm no expert, just my experience from trying to inform myself and things I've seen, yeah, they kind of just keep going and going. And I feel like that's what they're meant to do.
And I think I've seen that, and it's a really complicated issue because there are so many things going on, but you can definitely get to a situation where you have population overshoot, where they go past their carrying capacity and they use up resources, whether that's, in the atmosphere of the enclosure, or if it has to be with food or anything. Especially some of the more prolific species can totally get there. And one thing that not everybody's aware of, I'm sure you're aware of this, and probably some other people, but isopods most species release ammonia as a gas directly. And so that could be something that may have played into that particular case.
For sure. And I actually wasn't aware of that. I mean, I guess I could have figured at some point, but yeah, no, that's good to know. And that would definitely be a bad thing. I almost think too, just to add, I think it would be more beneficial to that individual or anyone else to almost regulate how much the culture is being fed as a means of controlling the population, because I feel like you're almost better off feeding a modest amount of food, never mind controlling mold and mites. That's also a good way of doing that, but just like enough that the population kind of floats around a certain amount or cap, as opposed to giving it everything it needs so it just continues to grow, because then you're going to have maybe a smaller population that you can control that's the right amount for the size enclosure. Like, obviously they're going to keep reproducing, but you're going to have individuals that, sounds kind of morbid, but like that don't get food because the stronger individuals get to it first. And then hopefully you kind of have like a maxed out population. I think you'll run into fewer problems doing that because you'll have enough healthy individuals that keep eating and reproducing, as opposed to giving them everything they want and having leftovers that they keep breeding. And then you get to weirder problems, maybe. I don't know if that's worth mentioning. But
I think it's totally worth mentioning. It's kind of what Josh was saying in the chat about carrying capacity, and you can manipulate the carrying capacity by the resources, like you're saying. If you're putting just enough food in, that's what you're doing essentially, is you're making that cap, like you're saying, of carrying capacity. And part of that is like leaf litter and things like that. Most species will breed a lot more readily if they have a lot of leaf litter, and they may have plenty of food to keep them alive if they don't have leaf litter, but the leaf litter will encourage them to breed. So if you want them to slow down, you can, go a little lighter on the leaf litter and heavier on the other supplementary foods, and you can, kind of manipulate that balance to some extent.
That is very true.
Yeah, Oren talks about that in his book, and it's it's pretty good stuff. So I totally agree. I think that's a great point that you made there. And then Critters and More had a question too. They have a 5-gallon cube and want to put some display isopods in, and are wondering about BC maple, magic potions, or Punta Cana or gem mix, or other options. What would you say would be a great display isopod for a 5-gallon cube?
So some of those, in my experience, a lot of those isopods, I mean, first of all, I guess a lot of isopods like to hide, but I feel like a lot of those options given or mentioned were pretty shy. Like, I find that they're either burrowing or under wood. I found the Porcilio ornatus, unless they really were set on Armadillidium, I find my Porcilio ornatus and Flavomarginatus are always out. They're out on top of wood. They pop the color. So it's a nice colored animal, especially the high yellow ornatus, Porcilio ornatus. Do you keep? Yes, I think you do. You have the Armadillidium species albino Japan. Don't you have those?
I have the. No, I don't actually. I have an albino. I have I have T-negative albinos.
Yeah. And
then I have magic potions, but I don't have the species Japan.
Yeah, it could be that my cultures of the magic potions is just a bit smaller. And I'm sure it depends what they have for wood and everything in the enclosure, but I find mine are always hiding. But I have those, the species albino, the Japanese ones, and they're always congregating all over the top of wood. I have some on the bottom, but they're out in the open. So if you get your hands on those, my experience has been that they're pretty bold. But I find some of the larger Porcilio species definitely seem to kind of hang out on top of wood and such. But I guess it's also important to remember, like, I feel like in general, isopods maybe aren't the most display kind of animals that'll just be out in the open, especially if the enclosure is brightly lit for any type of plant growth or anything like that. They might kind of hide away from it. But I feel like those are pretty good. And then I'm sure if the population just gets to a large number, you'll have a lot of them that'll just resort to being on top of the wood and hardscape too. Right.
Big population definitely does that. And I would totally agree with Porcilio ornatus. I haven't kept Flavomarginatus yet. I want to. But as far as Porcilio ornatus, I have the yellow dot, or the south, whatever you want to call that. And they are super day active all the time. That would be a great one. So the same experience. A couple of others. The powders, doesn't matter which morph, but any of the powders tend to be day active too. So they could be great. They're tiny, but they're active all day. I mean, I went to an insect zoo not that long ago, and they had this brightly lit vivarium growing plants, and they had bumblebees pollinating the flowers that were growing in it. And right out there in the bright light under these intense LEDs, there were powder oranges running all over the place. And so That's a good one. And then, of course, I think Ken Malinsky mentioned it in the chat. He said dairy cows. Dairy cows are awesome that way too. Super day active, even in the light. And milkbacks. My milkbacks are crazy. You drop a piece of food into, I have them in one of the tarantula cribs enclosures so that you can see right into it. Drop fish food in there and boom, there's a huge swarm of them running around doing their thing right in the middle of the day. So there are a few species, but I would totally agree with what you said that in general, isopods are just kind of, reticent to come out in the light, but you could then find those few exceptions for a display tank. Let's see. Okay. One more Patreon question. Would you ever consider gifting isopods to someone? Because, there's a lot of issues about gifting live animals to someone, and that can be a problem. Would you ever do it? And if so, under what circumstances?
Sure, I can use a live example, but firstly, I don't know if we're just going to assume it's stating the obvious. I mean, it is controversial. I actually brought this up as my question of the day last video before today. I don't necessarily, I don't agree with surprising people with animals as a gift. I'll put it that way. So I think that if let's give it an example that parents have a child that has been researching something like a leopard gecko for months, and they know that that child is, capable of caring for that animal, and they're going to be there even as like mentors or kind of second in command, or to make sure that that animal gets the care it needs. I'm okay with that because it's not a surprise. The person had the intention to own that animal, and they are competent and know what they're doing. It's the surprising and giving people that aren't prepared a life as a gift that I have an issue with. But to answer the question, I have gifted isopods to someone before. I have some good friends in British Columbia when I used to live there. Their youngest daughter has really sort of followed in her mother's footsteps and really loves isopods. So she's always helping her take care of the culture she has. And so before I left and moved to Ontario, for those of you watching maybe that have seen that video, I actually gifted her some armadillo species officinalis grease, because they stridulate and hiss and everything. And then she's doing well with them from what I know. And she was ecstatic, super thrilled. And obviously she's young and her mother is sort of overseeing everything and probably the main individual involved in their care. But it wasn't something where the animal was going to someone just because they wanted it and maybe didn't even know how to care for it. Like there's some thought involved, and the bottom line is that the individual is prepared for the commitment and capable financially, mentally, everything else to take care of those animals. So
yeah, I think that sounds really good. I think I remember at a reptile expo a few years ago, it was maybe 5 years ago or something like that. We were there and my daughter won a leopard gecko at a raffle. I mean, we just, from our ticket. Yeah. And immediately when that happened, when they called her name, and I felt a lot of stress, because not that I'm stressed about a leopard gecko specifically, but just like I wasn't prepared for this. Sure. What are we going to do with this? And so I talked to my wife, talked to my daughter for a minute, and we figured it out and said, okay, we can make this work. But the fact that I was being surprised with a life, like you were saying, really kind of stressed me out. And it's not something that I'd want to put on someone. And so even with isopods, although they are, generally much less of a commitment than a leopard gecko in a lot of ways, unless it's someone I know who already has a collection, and I totally know that this is going to be something that's going to work for them, I would really hesitate to give them a gift of isopods without talking to them first. Yeah, so I think I'm right up the same lines that you just mentioned. So, okay, well, we've got lots of questions in the chat. Wally would like to know about your leaf tails. Just a little update on your leaf tail geckos.
Oh, for sure. So leaf tails are doing really good. They're all in, as I don't know if I need to give an up there, but explain that at all. But if you guys want, you can check out my channel, and I've posted a video explaining it. So I've moved all my leaf-tailed geckos into quarantine bins, if you will. They're set up on paper towel right now. And so the last few weeks, I've just been keeping them like that. And I'm tearing down all their bioactive enclosures to kind of keep them more simply. There are a few different changes being made. So I won't digress too much more on that. But they're doing really well. All of them are doing fantastic. A few of the females have actually laid duds on the paper towel, unfortunately, because they're not being paired up or anything in this state. And yeah, I fed them all yesterday. I think I mentioned that, and cleaned them out. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. Oh, well, yeah, I should add, sorry. I'm planning to actually, like, now that they've been in there and doing well for a while, I'd like to set up a time to have the fecals done with Dr. Brown. So I'm thinking probably next week would be best for that. And that'll be the next step in that whole initiative if you're following along with it. So just get clear fecals on that and then have them move back into their larger enclosures, just set up differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing, because I remember seeing that you were switching them out of the bioactives. And I think it's really important for people to understand that, yes, bioactives are awesome. They're great. They're wonderful. They're a part of the hobby. They should be, but they're not the answer for everything all the time. Yeah. They're just not.
Yeah, it's a tricky one too. And I don't mean to make a very bold statement here. But the reality is, if you compare them to any other gecko in the hobby that's like people are more familiar with, the reality is not that many people are keeping them. And although there are individuals that have success keeping and raising them, they have their challenges too. Like, best believe I do everything I can to stay in contact with anyone I know that has a great amount of success, whether it's individuals in Belgium, Ukraine, England, United States. Lots of the people that are having a great amount of success reproducing this species in particular, I'm already in contact with them. And I myself have had a lot of success breeding them. But just in the last year or two, and I know that perhaps some of it is temperature related, I've had a few issues. So I'd like to try this and kind of use this as like a neutral zone. I know this is safe, if that makes sense, what I'm doing now, and then work my way back up and try and rule out what might have been wrong, if there was something wrong. But yeah, like you were saying, bioactive isn't kind of the end all. Like, we want to see our animals behave and live in a very naturalistic setup. Like, that's very rewarding. But that style of keeping has its set of issues or challenges as well. Like, and I think one of the things I brought up was the ability to keep things clean, because a lot of folks think, well, if it's in bioactive, it's self-sustaining. I don't have to do much. Maybe I wipe the glass, but the critters, the bioactive cleanup crew will clean the poop and everything. But, you know, a lot of animals can get pinworms and things like that from crickets even. People don't realize. And if your poop's just sitting around and a cricket eats it, you're going to complete that cycle again when your pet gets to it. You know, there's a lot to consider. Whereas if it was in a very sterile environment, you'd notice that poop right away and clean it out, and that wouldn't happen. So, I mean, that's just one example of how it might not work. But bottom line, like, I'm all about bioactive. If you see my enclosures, I advocate for that. I think it's super rewarding. I love plants, and that's how I'd like to get back to keeping them. But right now, because they're so rare, because I care about them, and whatever is going wrong, whether I'm aware of it or not, I know that that's a safe way I can keep them. I'm moving them like that, like moving into those setups, and that's how I'm going to keep them. And I'd like to get back to that. But yeah, there's a few folks that were like pretty upset about that change. But I hope that kind of explains a bit about how I deduce, like, making that decision. Yeah, it's an interesting thing.
Totally makes sense. And I think it's just important for people to recognize that, like you said, it's not that you don't like bioactive, not that you don't want to do that, but there are times when it just doesn't work, and you need to kind of set that aside and work back.
Yeah.
Very, very important to keep that in mind. It's not a step backward, really. It's a step forward so that you can figure out what's going on and solve problems.
Yeah, that's definitely the hope. It seems to be good so far.
So, do you have crickets. Ken Malinsky's saying that his cats think that there are crickets in his speakers. So
I do. They're singing the song of their people quite loudly right now. So sorry about that, or I hope it's entertaining your cats. But yes, there's definitely some crickets serenading the background right now.
I would blame myself, but I'm actually far away from the cricket room right now. And a lot of my videos, there are crickets. But in this one, I'm like opposite side of the house. So.
Yeah, there's never a shortage of those little guys, little Jiminy's in this room.
Do you do, do you do the house crickets or the banded crickets? It sounds like house crickets.
Yeah, so the pet store that I get them from local here is Pet Culture Guelph. Give them a little shout out. On Mondays, they get the house crickets, and they're a bit larger. So I try to make sure I grab a big load of the 1-inch size, especially for the Chinese crocodile lizards. They really like them. And the Tokays, like Tiki, represent. And the banded crickets tend to be, funny enough, the more prevalent or more popular option here now. Most of the suppliers these pet stores get their crickets from are now carrying the banded crickets. I understand that they're more hardy, but they are a bit annoying. They have much more of like a longer trill for the call, and they're very hardy. But I find sometimes some of the animals struggle to get them. Like I'm happy to use them, but I have noticed a lot of people say that. I have even heard people say they're a bit more aggressive. I don't know how I feel about that. That hasn't been my experience. But yeah, most people now carry the bandeds. And yeah, I think the biggest downfall of them is just that the mature animal or adult insect isn't quite as large, right? It's nearly a third of the size. I think 3/4 inches is the largest you'll get out of those, whereas the house, nice sized female, at least an inch in size. So
right, definitely a lot more massive.
Yeah.
Oh, we just got a super chat from the Tarantula Collective. Hey, thanks, Richard. He says, love both your channels. Awesome to see you having an in-depth conversation. Keep up the awesome work. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
We appreciate that. He's got a great channel too. I enjoy Richard's channel a lot. Well, he's got two great channels, the Tarantula Collective and the Exotic Pet Collective. So
yeah,
fun stuff.
No, fantastic content.
Yeah, definitely. He's got great quality video and everything.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Steven Spielberg of tarantula keeping.
Yeah, definitely.
But I joke.
Okay. Oh, this is interesting. Josh says he has a colony of gray bird grasshoppers. They're bigger than crickets, very hardy, and don't make any noises except for jumping.
Wow. That is very
That's cool. I think it would be interesting to culture something like that. That would be awesome.
I wish I could.
Yeah, you're very limited in which insects you can culture in Canada, aren't you?
Yeah, it's very strange. I guess the Canadian government, CFIA is the acronym, Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They're very meticulous, and there's a lot of blanket bans, or very protective of the agricultural industry here. And I can't speak for the country or anything, but my limited understanding is that, yes, so most insects, unless they're already, I guess, being used in the, I would say the, I guess, pet trade as feeders or fishing, are pretty well like not allowed. I think we're allowed like blue bottle fly maggots or larvae, like different fruit flies. But I mean, it's probably easier to say what isn't allowed. It's basically most insect groups besides, like we're not even allowed, it seems like a bit of a gray area now, but we're not really allowed mantids besides the Mantis religiosa, European mantis, the Tenodera sinensis, probably butchering the Latin pronunciation, but the Chinese mantis. And those are allowed, ironically, as, I guess, pest control. So they're non-native species that are systematically released into the wild as Tokay. And, but then everything else isn't allowed. We can't have roaches. Can't have beetles besides just the two mealworms and superworms. So it's pretty sad every time I see you guys, all your cool insects. And I know some states are more strict, but it's I'm so envious. I've had the privilege of visiting a few exotic pet shops in the States, and I see all these millipedes and all kinds of interesting critters, phasmids, and just like, come on, I wish. We are allowed tarantulas, centipedes, scorpions. I guess it also depends. We have municipal bylaws too that can control what's allowed as well. So, but yeah, not the same. I'm afraid.
Yeah, and even the U.S. has some pretty tight controls against certain things. Like phasmids are really hard to transport across state lines without permits. There are a lot of snails that are regulated. Beetles, a lot of beetles are regulated actually, and there are some that aren't or not very tightly enforced. But for example, a lot of the exotic beetles that people keep in Europe very widely, they're illegal here. So there's a lot of that going on too. But you understand the reasoning behind it. And in some cases, I'm hoping that information can be disseminated to the proper channels so that we can say, oh, we can establish this is not going to get established anywhere. And hopefully both in Canada and the US, certain things can become legal eventually when that is established. There's more information, hopefully. So Lil Key says, I'm so happy and thankful that both Aquarimax and Reptiliatus were the ones that got me into keeping poison dart frogs. Thank you both. That's awesome.
Our pleasure.
That is pretty cool.
That's awesome. Hope you're enjoying your frogs. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, hope you're enjoying your frogs.
Yeah, that's I've really enjoyed keeping dart frogs, and I don't have as many as you do, but they're really fun.
They're so cool. They're really interesting, and I think it's so special that they're diurnal too, for the most part, I should say. I have a few that decide that they're nocturnal sometimes when they call at night, but that makes it kind of neat too, because a lot of frogs are nocturnal, as most folks would know, and it's I don't know. I joke that it's like the terrestrial version of keeping fish. You can set up this incredibly beautiful vivarium, and that's more than half the fun. And you really get to just create this canvas, and then these beautiful little jewels come into play, and they have such a low bio load on the environment. They're light, they don't damage the plants for the most part, and that's just so rewarding. Not without being too cheesy, but it's just so beautiful to watch. It's almost therapeutic or meditative. Just sit there and watch these little animals hop around, and there's more brains in those little bodies than you'd think, or at least they're more bold than you would think in many cases. Some of my frogs, they really recognize the swishing of the container of fruit flies. They all come up to the front and they're waiting. Those little beings they're cheeky. Yeah. I totally see what you're saying. And you also have the advantage of, I started out with fish, and I still keep fish and breed fish and whatever, but it's really interesting that when you have dart frogs and fish, I liked how you compared them. But one interesting thing is that dart frogs, you don't have the problem of algae and trying to balance that as much, nor do you have to do frequent water changes like you do on an aquarium, partial water changes. And so in a lot of ways, a dart frog enclosure is just easier. Yeah, it's true. That really depends how you set it up. I mean, some people add those water features, and that only complicates things, but it can be rewarding too. It's a very good point.
Yeah. Oh, it looks like Wally has to go. Thank you, Wally, for coming in. There's a lot of chat that I'm missing, but okay. Chris, the Mad Aquarius, wants to know if your Tokays call at night.
Yes. So good question there. Funny enough, so they definitely do. That's the first answer. Tiki in particular. The rest of them don't. There's a bit of vocalization here and there, like squawking if they're, I don't know, not getting along, which rarely ever happens. Like if they're going for the same cricket and one misses and the other one like pokes their head or something. But Tiki would be the animal that's calling the most, and he hasn't done that in ages. I do have the mature female that, funny enough, I haven't named yet, separate from him and the two twins, or I call them the twins, it's two offspring. But yeah, when they do call, it is loud. I always tell folks to keep that in mind. I was very fortunate that this wasn't an issue I had, but for anyone that lives in an apartment and is considering a Tokay gecko as a pet, especially a male, I could be wrong, but I think for the most part, it's just the males that do the very pronounced, loud Tokay call. It's loud. I distinctly remember a summer in Vancouver when I lived in an apartment with these animals. Fortunately, the walls are thick, where I had my balcony window open and Tiki started calling away, and there was a party upstairs, I think, and people were on the balcony. I literally heard them stop. And they're like, what is that? I was like, I didn't know what to do. I just like closed my sliding door. But I've walked into my like floor in the apartment when I was living in the apartment. And before I got in the door, I could hear him faintly calling. So they are loud animals. But yeah, he hasn't done it in some time. He'll probably start now, right? That'd be funny. But yeah, no, they do make some pretty like loud noise. It's no joke. So consider that. You wouldn't want someone like calling and complaining that there's a strange noise. But it's so weird. I mean, if you haven't heard it before, you should look it up after like Tokay call. You wouldn't believe that noise coming out of that little animal. Like it's quite something.
It is. It's such a strange sound. It reminds me of somebody, I don't know, stretching a piece of rubber or something almost. It's
kind of squeak toy, like gone rogue or something.
Yeah, it's weird.
Because there's the main call, and then they get to this point where it's like a Daffy Duck machine gun or something like that, or I don't know what to compare it to. They just really go off until they run out of air, and that's well, I guess it's actually the other way around. That trill or machine gun thing happens first, and then they just kind of use whatever air they have left to do the Tokay, and then it ends with a weird scruffy trill. But yeah, they're so cool, very rewarding animals.
Yeah. I think a Tokay is one of those geckos that I think, oh, that would be really fun as long as it's a young captive bred individual, so it can be tame and not rip my fingers off every time I try to interact with it.
Yeah, they're not as bad as people make them out to be, but I also think that's more so the case if it's not important for you to be able to handle your pet. If they're kind of a display or glorified display animal that you can easily condition one to be tolerant of coming out to do some tongue feeding and whatnot over time. And I think that in itself is already great. And you don't have to worry about them being aggressive. I think it's just that if they feel constrained or if you're trying to grab them, then yeah, like they're probably the worst thing ever to grab. but they're really cool. They're really cool. Beautiful too.
Yeah, they really are. Okay, we've got a super chat from Mr. and Mrs. Morelia.
Hey, you got another one.
Besides P. laevis and P. pruinosus, other isopods good for feeders for crested geckos? Are mealworms good for cresties? Other easy supplemental feeders? Okay. You want to chime in on that first?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of people think that crickets are like the only thing you can give cresties for some reason as a feeder. I got people constantly berating me saying I shouldn't be feeding my cresties superworms. And I do give adult crested geckos smaller superworms sometimes as a treat. So that's one option. And personally, I really don't think it's necessary to do the whole crushing the head because they're going to chew their way out thing. An adult healthy animal is fully capable of crushing and subduing or immobilizing, whatever you want to put it, a superworm. You can also offer them silkworms, of course. They love those. And I don't want to steal the show, so if you want to add a few, Russ.
Okay. Well, I agree with the superworms. I don't really do mealworms very often for my cresties, but I do offer superworms. I think they're just a little softer and easier to digest. Actually, the P. ornatus South isopods, because they're not only are they really active, they're pretty big and very prolific. So they're not a bad feeder. If you're going to use isopods as feeders, other than the ones you mentioned, that's not a bad one. I have used the P. ornatus South or yellow dot for my leopard gecko, and I wouldn't hesitate to do it with my crested geckos. In fact, when our first crested gecko was really small, I gave her a lot of bean beetles when she was little, and she loved those and did well with those. But then as she was getting a little bit larger, I went to Porcellio scaber, and she was great with that too. So there's a couple other options there. So Ocean Dizzle wants to know if we have some plant species that we like. Ooh. I know you love planted vivarium, so you could probably think of a few there.
Sure. Okay, well, I mean, right off the bat, I really love different species of carnivorous plant, especially Nepenthes. They're super cool. Like, they're just incredibly interesting plants. Obviously, your fly traps are cool. Those another type of carnivorous plants. I mean, really carnivorous plants in general, very cool. For Bavaria, I really like. I mean, also just as house plants, I really like philodendrons. I think they're really beautiful plants, and there's so much. There's a midge fly, so much variability with those species and cultivars as well. Plant hobby is going crazy right now with, I guess, the pandemic and such, but the value of things are jumping. But yeah, philodendrons. I really like Margravia. That's a really cool plant I started keeping this year. A few species. What is it? The Sitenensis, or it's the one that like will start green, but different points of growth change color. So it's like changing. I find the new growth is like a bright orange. I think if I'm not mistaken, it like the reddish orange goes yellow to green. So it's almost like some kind of weird gummy, the way like the neon colors go as it grows. It's a beautiful plant. But yeah, they're really nice as well. And yeah, kind of leave it at that.
Cool.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry.
I was just going to say, I actually like a lot of carnivorous plants too. And like Drosera capensis is one that I played with a little bit that I like a lot. Venus flytraps, I've had those and I like them a lot. I really like the Neoregelia bromeliads.
Oh, yeah, of course.
I find them a lot easier to do in a vivarium than the Tillandsias in most cases. I've had Tillandsias do well for me for like a few years, but I think they tend to die off if you're not, they can either get too dry or too wet and too stagnant. And the Neoregelias, you just throw them in a dart frog vivarium and they just do their thing and you're fine. So I like those a lot. And I like a lot of the succulents too, like the jade plants, the mini jade plants, and how you can put them in an arid vivarium. They do their thing. Lots of the ferns I like too. I could go on. There's a lot of plants that I like.
Right? So. It's impossible to stop.
Yeah, exactly.
All of them.
And let's see. Little Key wants to know if clown isopods are good for beginners.
Ooh. Okay, so like I wouldn't say it depends, because I mean if you do all your research well ahead and set them up properly, you know what you're getting yourself into. Like I don't think that they're one of those species that's like so finicky that, like for me, I've had a challenging time with some of the rare Cubaris. And I think that even when you're well informed, you can still have challenges with those. But I think that if you know how to keep some of the species of Armadillidium that, like, at least in my experience, prefer a little bit more ventilation and such, they're really not. It's not like rocket science. So although I would recommend like Porcilio laevis or some Scabers or something like that, like as a bit more of a beginner isopod, as far as Armadillidium go, like I find a lot of them are sort of straightforward and similar in care, and they're not one of those weird anomalies that needs more delicate or meticulous care. So I don't know, if you really do the research, I don't think they're that bad. I think the biggest mistake people make with those is keeping them too moist.
Mm-hmm. Yep, they don't have a gradient, or they keep them too moist and don't get them enough ventilation. Yeah. And as long as they're doing that, I think they're okay. Mm-hmm. There's just, like when I started with them, it was before I, knew a lot about a whole lot of isopods, and I had some trouble with them. I never had them die all the way off, but I had some die back at first. Mm-hmm. And then once I dialed into their husbandry, now they just explode. So I think as long as you got this husbandry, the basics down, you're going to be good.
Yeah. I feel like they're one of those ones that likes to be more on the dry side and just have their moistened corner than the opposite for sure, by any means. And then just good amount of ventilation at all times.
Exactly. Totally agree there. Tip Top Taylor wants to know if different Armadillidium vulgare color morphs breed with each other.
That is a good question. The honest answer is that I'm not for sure certain. Maybe they do. I mean, that's an interesting question, because like I know I've heard from a few people that some of the different laevis forms don't interbreed, like the wild type with like say orange or something. So begs the question of I mean, definitely need some barcoding and different text and what to be done with these animals. But I don't know. I mean, if you had a random morph of like albinism or some kind of morph pop up in a natural, or let's say like natural form enclosure, I don't see why like that would obviously interbreed, and either it would be something like codominant or whatever that would perpetuate that color, or maybe it would just revert back to being heterozygous and just not having a different color, like whatever, you know what I'm trying to say. Like you might just have it breed and it might not manifest different color variation, but I don't see why, if they're the same species, absolutely, I don't see why they can't interbreed. But I feel like with some of those other things like the Lavis, I'm wondering if we call them the same species, but they're not actually.
Yeah, I agree. When they've created like the gem mix of Armadillidium vulgare, all it is a bunch of morphs they threw together and they'll breed. And because most of them are single gene recessive traits, after a couple generations, you're getting a lot of those traits combining and bouncing out and everything. So it does seem to work fine with Armadillidium vulgare. But I agree with what you just said about the P. lavis. It appears like that we have two different species going on. Because I've tried to cross a couple different types of P. lavis with no success. And there are people who have told me, a couple people have said that what it may be going on is that the P. lavis that has produced dairy cow and milkback is actually a larger African species that was confused with P. lavis. And they get bigger, their activity levels are different, and they don't interbreed. And when I've tried to cross both of those with orange, at least so far, no dice. It's not happening. And when it was super easy to cross Porcellio Scaber Orange and Porcellio Scaber Dalmatian, for example, it just happened. It was boom and done. And this is not happening at all. And so I think that may be what's going on, which is good news in some ways, because cool, we have this species that's different and more active and whatnot. But what that may mean for the hobby if people say, well, it's not lavis, so you can't keep it anymore until we decide that you can. That could be a problem.
True. I definitely need to inform myself better, and I'm cautious or hesitant to say too much. Like I'm saying this as like speculation. I feel like I read somewhere in some paper that when I was trying to learn a little bit about isopod reproduction, that it's very hard for any of them to hybridize just because their morphology, it's really like pieces of a puzzle that fit together with their reproductive organs. So even if there was the interest, like they wouldn't really be able to if they're too different. So I'm sure that sort of plays into it as well. But yeah, I want to say a year or two ago, I saw a video someone posted in one of the Facebook Isopod groups of like them finding or collecting wild dairy cows. And it wasn't that it was like a mutation existing in a gray colored culture. It was like the whole population, and it was very dry clay, like a hill or slope, and he was digging through it and they were just crawling around everywhere. I wish I could find it. I'll have to find it somehow and show you. But he was like, it just was labeled dairy cows. And yeah, sorry. So the whole population or group of isopods, they were all the same. They were all dairy cows. So I'm looking at this thinking, sure, you can definitely have a mutation that's effective. Maybe it's ideal because there's good camouflage and that whole population can take on that trait over time. But I thought it was a little peculiar to think that we're calling it just like a random mutation and then the whole population looks like that. Maybe, but it kind of adds to your point that maybe it's a different species altogether.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that a population had been found like that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it was someone, I thought, it concerned me a bit that you said Africa, because now I'm wondering, yeah, it was definitely, they were dairy cows. I have to try and find it for you. I'll have to send it to you if I can find it, even for myself. It was well over a year ago or a year and a half ago or something in the main, I guess that biggest Facebook isopod group. Someone posted that.
Yeah, I would be totally interested if you can find that.
For sure.
So Josh had a question about the reproductive rate of different Ornatus, Porcellio ornatus subspecies. How many Ornatus subspecies do you keep? Or not subspecies, but morphs?
I only have the one, high yellow, so that may be something you'd have to comment on more.
I only have two. I've got the high yellow, which is a fairly new one for me, and they're reproducing, but I've only had them since June. And
Yeah,
so
I think I saw a video of that.
I can't really say a whole lot about them except that they are reproducing. But my Ornatus with the subspecies, or not the locality, I'll say, the locality that is called yellow dot, yellow spot, gold dot, yellow south, dark south. It's called all these different things. That one is extremely prolific. So far, it's been more prolific than the high yellows.
Does it get as large?
And it's big.
Okay.
I'll have to do some comparison in size, but it looks pretty big, and they've always been extremely active, and they reproduce really fast. And the high yellows, I think, are just not quite as hardy, but I'm not sure about how prolific they are yet because I haven't kept them long enough to tell.
Yeah, like I'm sure I've had a few hiccups with them, but like they seem like I would definitely say they're more prolific than like any of the real big like Spanish giants. Like they're pretty fast, but they're definitely like they take a while to get going. But when they do, like they really grow in numbers. Like they're pretty good. Like they produce a lot of mankai, and then I don't know. I haven't had too many issues with them, but once in a while, I find that if I'm not very tentative, they eat their food too fast, and then they do turn on each other a little bit once in a while. I've found that at least, unless it's just this coincidence that maybe one or two have just like passed away, and then they take advantage of the protein. But I think that they do cannibalize a bit if there isn't a decent amount of protein available. So I try and always make sure there's dried fish for them, but I don't like to leave too big of a piece around because that encourages mites. Right. But I do find that they're very receptive to eating the dried minnows and such. It seems to be something they enjoy a lot. Most do, obviously. But.
Right, but especially some of the big Porcellio species, including dairy cows. I mean, there's some of the... If I stick my hand into isopod enclosure, some people ask if isopods bite, right? And I've never been damaged by an isopod, but I have been nibbled by isopods.
Oh, yeah.
Porcellio ornatus, Porcellio laevis, and Porcellio scaber are like the big three that seem to nibble. If I stick my hand in there and I haven't fed them yet, they'll crawl all over my hand and start nibbling. And it doesn't hurt, but it totally happens. So, they seem to be some of the big protein-hungry ones.
Definitely. I even remember, I think it was this year, there's a video circling around of someone trying to bring it to everyone's attention that they can be somewhat aggressive. It was like a video of, I think it was a laevis. It was like subduing and eating a mealworm. Did you happen to see that video? It was all over her Instagram at one point. They're trying to show that. Yeah, like it was one or two of them. And I mean, I think at first it was the one, and it managed to like bite through part of its exoskeleton. And then obviously there's a bit of wet tissue comes out, and the rest of them come over. And it's just a good way of showing like they can be aggressive animals. You know, I see people that say like, oh, I'm looking for some isopods for my dart frog enclosure. And they're just about to pick up a culture of scaber, Porcellio scaber. And I think personally, I don't know what your experience has been, but I would be very, very hesitant or weary of ever considering putting some of those larger hardy isopods in a culture, or sorry, in a vivarium with dart frogs. Because I mean, you have these moist-bodied, very, I don't know, like calm, gentle, non-aggressive, not good at defending themselves types of animals. I mean, you're putting them in with amphibians, like they could easily gang up on a frog. You know, you get one of them, they just kind of grab a leg, and the rest is history. They slow them down. And especially at night when they're sleeping, like I wouldn't put anything bigger than the dwarf whites or dwarf purples in with frogs. I feel like that's worth mentioning to people, because a lot of people want to move into bioactive and they want to add isopods and clean up crew to a dart frog enclosure. And anything larger than those two mentioned, I think, is a bit dangerous for frogs. It's one thing with reptiles and animals that'll try and eat them, but
and I love keeping Porcellio laevis with one of my cresties. I decided to try it out and see how it went, and they're fine in there with him, and it's not a problem. But I wouldn't put them in with my frogs. Yeah, no, the frogs, they're too delicate. I think that's the main thing. And If you want to try getting tadpoles from them, I mean, good night.
Yeah, that too, right? They're just gonna go for the eggs. You won't even get that chance.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's an even better point too.
So Sammy wants to know, what is too humid for zebras?
Ooh. Like a percentage, or
I mean, it's hard to say. That's sort of some relative terms. But would you say that your zebras do better with a large dry area, or do they care about a humidity gradient and a moisture gradient?
So I've experimented a little bit with substrate. Like at one point or more recently, I sort of added a lot more kind of like orchid bark to the substrate. And if I'm being honest, I feel like they've done worse since. So although I wouldn't suggest having the soil be like super moist or wet, obviously, I do think that they might do a little bit better if the substrate was like, see, it's hard to say because you kind of just feel it and you know what it is, but like not evenly moist by any means, but it all depends on the ventilation. So if there's like a very good amount of like, horizontal and vertical or like ventilation on the sides of the bin, just even drilled holes, and then you have a nice amount of open ventilation through the top, and then like a few inches of substrate that at least at the lower levels are like a bit moist, not too moist. Like I think if it's drier and there's lots of wood and such, and then one little corner of pretty moist sphagnum or something like that, I find that seems to be doing really well for me. I've tried keeping them a lot drier, and all my monkai are just all in the moss corner, and there's a few adults kind of all over the place, but they weren't really reproducing much. So I almost imagined it to be like a dry season or something, and they're very inactive. But then I added more moisture and more kind of pumicy soil to it, and they just became a lot more active and started reproducing again. So yeah. It's
interesting to see. I think one thing that we need to think about is that I would agree. I think the zebras they definitely need a moist area, and then they definitely need some space that's not quite as wet, but there's some wiggle room in there, and a lot of that has to do with microclimate and all kinds of things, because your climate is going to be a lot different than mine, for example. So you might need more ventilation than I do, because it's a lot warmer here in the summer. It's a lot drier here all the time, for example. But then also in the summer, I'm using an evaporative cooler, which makes the air more humid. And in the winter, I'm using central heating, which I'm sure you are too, and that makes it drier. And there's all these different things that we're thinking about. And whether your isopods are up against an external wall, which is going to change the temperature both in summer and winter, or they're up against an internal wall, there's so many things that are going to change the exact conditions. But yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why in the hobby there's been like a bigger push towards gradients, because then they're going to find the spot that they need when they need it. And all those situations are going to be mitigated to some degree because they have a choice.
And that definitely like makes a lot of sense. And with that, like the easiest way to achieve that is to have more space too. But then that becomes more of a challenge when your collections get bigger as well. But yeah, it's true. Yeah.
I remember the first time when I got zebras, they were one of my first, probably I had about half a dozen species for a year or two, and then I got zebras along with a few others. So I went from half a dozen species to maybe a dozen species along with those zebras. And that was about 6 years ago or something when I started doing that. And at the time, I found somebody on a dart frog forum, because those were the only people who were talking about isopods at the time, pretty much, that said, I put big, like 1 or 2 inch holes in the top and covered them with screening of some kind of mesh. So I did that with my zebras, and they reproduced for me. And so I started doing that with everything, armadillidium. And then, over time, I realized that, that generally works really well, but there's more than one way to ventilate an isopod enclosure, and so many different isopods. You can't say all armadillidium need a ton of ventilation, because not all of them do. There are some that are fine with not so much. And that's the same with Porcellia. There's some that need a lot and some that don't. And what does a lot of ventilation mean, and how does that differ from your situation and mine? There's so much variation and so much wiggle room in a lot of cases.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. It makes a lot of sense. Wow, 6 years ago too. I can't even imagine having like zebras that long ago. Because I feel like, honestly, I feel like the hobby was really in its infancy, at least in North America back then.
Yeah,
it must have. Yeah. I got my first. I think the most unique isopods, or I guess more hobby sort of isopods that I got, would have been 2 years ago. And they were the dairy cows and the zebras were the first ones that I got, other than just like collecting native ones here.
Mm-hmm.
But,
the hobby has really exploded in the past while. Because like I said, at the time when I started, because I started keeping isopods around 7 or 8 years ago, and I had like the oranges, Porcellia scaber, dwarf whites, dwarf purples, dwarf striped. And then shortly thereafter got powder blues and calicos, and then Dalmatians, I think. And then I moved here, and just my collection, I started getting into the zebras and all that stuff, and it just kind of ballooned from there. But yeah, at the time you could find some stuff on dendro board.
Right. Yeah.
And you could find a little bit of stuff on arachno boards, and that was it. There was nothing else.
Yeah. I mean, at the same,
Go ahead.
No, I apologize. I thought you were leaving it at that was it part. My bad.
No, that's fine.
Well, no, yeah. I guess come to think of it, I had dwarf whites, but I mean, dwarf whites.
Yeah.
We didn't have much access to anything else. There's one gentleman who, I think he's really just carrying them too for Bioactive. But yeah, it was like the dwarf whites and the dwarf purples. And then there's the, I'm forgetting the actual Latin name for them, but the Nagris cristatus, the Costa Rican great stripes. And those seem to have kind of dropped off the face of the earth, at least in Canada. A lot of people have been asking for them. And funny enough, I just kind of kept my little culture going, but I never really put them in a larger bin to really let them go crazy. So I'm trying to get them going again, because people can't seem to find them. But they're also a fun little one that works well for Bioactive, because they stay really small, but they're a bit bigger than the other two.
Right, and they're also parthenogenic. So
yes,
if you get a low population, you don't have to worry about it so much. You'll eventually have plenty. A funny thing is, though, they do seem to die off. Like, they seem to crash for some people. I've had them crash. Like, when I first started with them, they just blew up, and they were everywhere, super high density. And then they crashed, and I've had them ever since. They've never completely died off.
Yeah.
But I've never had it back to the numbers that I originally did. I'm not
interesting.
Sure why.
Huh.
So,
knock on wood, I haven't had that happen yet. But I mean, my numbers are not exploding. Like, if anything, the irony of it is that I think I had them kind of survive my journey from Vancouver to here, just as like castaways in other cultures. So then I just isolated them into their own. I'm like, all right, you guys made it. Let's get you going here. So
yeah, that's actually how I found mine too. I never originally the stock that I got was I just found in my morning gecko enclosure after having set it up and put the plants in there, and even having processed the plants and everything.
Interesting.
They just showed up in there, and I thought, oh, okay, well, we'll go with it. So that was kind of fun. Kate made a good points about isopods too. She said you can try and learn and study so much, but then you just have to try it and adjust. I think that's great.
Yeah.
So let's see. Just catching up. And Josh says 6 quarts have been the best size for starting most isopods. I think that is a good size. Mm-hmm. But also I found that if I use smaller ones for a short time, like depending on the species, of course, I wouldn't want to start like a giant Porcellia and something smaller than a 6 quart really. But say if I'm starting a Porcellia species or any of the smaller species, a smaller enclosure can be good for a few months until they've produced a clutch or two.
Yeah.
Just so that they're focused and you don't have to worry about all this excess space to make space for fungus nets or mites or whatever. And then once they're doing that, then you can move them over.
Yeah,
that can be good.
definitely. I agree with you. Sometimes when I prepare little cultures in like 16-ounce deli cups and such to sell, I'll have them set up kind of preemptively, it's funny, like you'll even put some dairy cows like, wow, they're really booming in here, even maybe compared to the mother culture, and whether it's maybe less competition or other things, whatever it is. Sometimes I think to myself, maybe I should do this and like kind of use them as like seeders if I ever need to move more back into the mother culture, if you will, or the main culture. That's a good point. Yeah, sometimes the confined space for a bit of time works really well to kind of kick or jumpstart things.
Right, because if you start with 10 and you put them in a 6-quart, it's going to be a while before it fills up. But if you start with, a 1-quart container of the right dimensions with 10, and then you have 30, 35, then you put them into that 6-quart, then it's going to really start rolling a lot faster. So someone had a question. Oh, Albatross Gaming was wondering if you know what a web spinner is. The kind of invertebrate that I think I remember him talking about working with that. Are you familiar with those?
I'm not sure. No, to be honest.
They're a really interesting creature that he was explaining to me, but I have not have any experience with them.
I guess we'll wait to see what they say.
Yeah, we can check it out. I know I've probably missed like a million questions because there were a ton of people talking here, and it's hard to catch them all.
Yeah, no, I'm having a hard time. Like, I'm sorry, everybody, if I'm missing so many questions too. Like, there's a lot.
Yeah, but it's been great. We've had a lot of participation.
Oh yeah,
which is awesome. And okay, so it looks like Make It Kate has a similar experience to what we were talking about with the containers. If you're starting off with a really small group and you put them in too big a container, they seem to have trouble. I had trouble with that with my my rubber duckies at first, and I moved them into a small container, and then they started breeding.
Yeah, I what are they now? I think they're like I'll show you real quick. They're right here. I use these like, oh, hold on. Yeah, it's like a 2.2 quarts. I like these to start them off when they're really little.
Yeah.
I find these work really well.
Yeah, do you get those at like a container store? Or?
I just get them at our local dollar store, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, they usually come in packs of 3 for like $3. That's Canadian dollars.
Okay. Yeah, I have a similar container that I just started out using that has the cool thing about it. It's similar. It's a little smaller than that, but not a whole lot smaller, and it has molded ventilation holes in it.
No way.
Yeah, so they're really small, and I'm experimenting. The containers with those types of holes in them have worked really well for me. That's where I got my rubber duckies breeding, but it was in a smaller size. And it was like a 7-ounce one, and so I moved up to the 21-ounce ones. And I'm going to be experimenting with those because the fact that they're molded ventilation holes means no drilling, of course, saving a ton of time. It's cross ventilation, which is great.
Awesome.
And then the holes are small enough that there's not a lot that can get in there. Phorid flies can't get in there. I'm not going to say fungus gnats can or can't yet because I'm not sure, but I'm going to test it out and see. So we'll see. And Sandy is asking if zebras are especially shy and hide all the time. What has been your experience?
So it's kind of tough to say, right? Because like for me, I keep all my isopods on like a pretty well shaded, shall I say, like shelf. There's just like a bunch of shelves, and they're in the dark, so I'm sure they're more comfortable coming out in like their version of being in the open because it's already not that well lit. But I feel like they're not crazy shy, but again, it has to do with like the population. If the population size is great, like they're gonna be out. Some of them will be on top of the wood because they'd rather be on something than just loosely running around in the substrate, less vulnerable. But I think they're one of those ones that, like most, would rather be underneath the wood, tucked away safe, than just kind of hanging out on top if they had the choice. They're not like crazy shy. Like, I mean, you can lift a piece of wood with a bunch of zebras on it and it'll just kind of congregate and sit there. Some of them might start like scurrying to the opposite side of the wood, but they're not one of those ones that's gonna be like, oh my god, light, and like hide right away.
Right, so, like clowns. Clowns seem to just scurry off as soon as you open it, but and they'll stay hidden most of the day, but they won't be out as much as the zebras. But the population is a huge factor. Like I have a 28 quart that must have, I don't know, 1,500 zebras in there or something. There's a ton in there. Like you lift up the cork bark and it's like pure zebra isopods wall to wall. But awesome. They're also just crawling all over too. I mean, there's a couple hundred that are just running around all the time. So population is a huge factor there. I think that's good that you bring that up. Little Key is asking if clown isopods are parthenogenic.
No, they're not, right?
No, they're not. The only species that I know of in the hobby that are for sure, almost for sure, parthenogenic all the time are the dwarf whites, the Urus cristatus, we call them dwarf striped here. There are different names for them. And then the Isopod species Tarragona appear to be parthenogenic as well.
Okay, I'm not too familiar.
They're not super common. And then there are some indications that some other species might be like facultatively parthenogenic, like crested geckos, maybe.
Right.
But
interesting.
The only ones that I know that are always parthenogenic that are in the hobby. There may be some others I'm not aware of. But.
Yeah, that would be the only ones besides that last one you mentioned that I'm familiar with as well.
So do you sell isopods when they start overpopulating an enclosure, or you just split your cultures? I
do sell them. It really helps with expenses and everything, and it's a nice way to spread the hobby too, frankly. It's twofold purpose, you could say. Yeah, I do. I haven't actually really offered many in the last little while. There's a local store, a local pet shop, the same one I mentioned before, that I usually sell a few cultures to, but like I don't usually sell my fancier isopods there, but like a few of the stables and popular options that I'll offer there. But yeah, sometimes I just like make a list and offer them to hobbyists.
Yeah, I think I've found it really helps me. That's most of the sales that I do, honestly, are isopods. I do sell other things, but that's the biggest thing I sell.
Oh,
and
nice. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's funny because I don't really advertise it all that much, but people find my website or whatever and they contact me. But if I were to advertise them, I kind of think I'd sell out pretty fast of everything.
Yeah, it's funny with the isopods. I feel like it's the one problem you don't have with other things. Like I find that people will ask for isopods and I can't, because I can't afford to sell more of them because the culture would be depleted. It's such a weird problem to have. Like sometimes with like the Flavomarginatus, for example, people will ask for them and they're a really lovely isopod that's worth a bit more than some of the other ones. And I'll get a few inquiries and it just kind of is like, oh, I wish I could sell a few of these right now. But I know that if I do, like I'm going to risk my own culture. So like things like that'll happen and it's quite funny. But I always joke with a few of my friends that like one of the best investments I ever made as far as wanting to like have something that I can sell is the dwarf whites. I think my friend and I went to a reptile show and we split we went 50-50 on like a $15 culture of them 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago. And like the amount of individual cultures we've produced from those since, just like taking them to our own collections and just seeding tanks and just making little deli cups and selling them for, the price goes all over the place. Like sometimes like there's a shop here that sells them for $20 a culture for 20 of them.
Wow.
I don't know. Like, I mean, whatever works. The fact that the market supports that, I usually see them for like $12 a culture or something for 20 individuals. Like they go for that here. I know the Canadian market is totally different than there. I'm not sure what they go for there, but I mean, just that, like the amount I sold, I've probably made honestly over $1,000 selling dwarf whites off that $7 initial purchase, right? So you can't go wrong. Isopods they can be money makers too for some people. Yeah. We had a reptile expo not that long ago, and someone came to
take a bunch of isopods and sell them, from me. He bought them from me to sell there.
Yeah.
And the dwarf whites were the first ones to go. Like sold out of all the ones that I got them like instantly. And then the other ones were, hit and miss, but those just went super fast. And those were, I didn't even ever buy dwarf whites. They showed up when I got my first colonies of other isopods. And I'm like, what? Oh, these are dwarf. Okay. And I separated them out, started breeding them. So I never even paid for them.
Lucky those in the Negris Cristatus.
Yep.
No, it's so true. It's crazy. And I'm sure a lot of that also has to do with the surge in bioactivity too, right? Like they're the stable go-to isopod option for those types of enclosures. So with that, like everybody's like, well, I need my dwarf whites now for my crested gecko tank. I need to seed the tank with those or whatever it's gonna be, right? So that you're the go-to for that.
Yeah. So do you have any tips for giant canyon isopods?
I actually haven't kept those. They're fairly common, right? But I haven't had them. I think I know about their care, but you have them, right? Don't you? Yeah. So it'd probably be more applicable for you to answer that question.
Well, I would say giant canyons are super easy. They're not particularly picky about ventilation. They can do well in a fairly dry setup as long as they have a moist area, a hydration station. But they're not super picky about anything else. They do like to burrow a lot. So if you want to keep them as a bioactive cleanup crew member, they're a good option for something that might otherwise eat them because they tend to burrow so thoroughly, and then they'll come out at night. So if you have like a larger diurnal creature, you could keep them with them because they're likely to survive because they'll bury. They're pretty prolific, and they do like their protein, but they like their leaves. They like anything. They're big eaters, but they generally won't eat it during the day very much. They'll come out at night and do their thing. So they can be good for that kind of situation. They're not a great display species because they just bury themselves. And they are a great species to demonstrate tonic immobility. They will halfway curl up and just freeze if you mess with them for a little while, and they'll stay in that position. So if you're ever in a position you want to show someone what tonic immobility looks like in a creature, they're a good one for that.
That's an awesome response. I think they're native to quite literally near Canyon. Are they not in Arizona? Am I wrong?
I think that species does range into Arizona, I think, and I believe the locality from which the giant canyon individuals were collected is in California.
Okay, but
I range into Arizona too.
Yeah, because I definitely filmed them, so I know they're in that video, the Pet Fest video I did last year, but I'm fairly certain when we went out exploring one night looking for scorpions and other critters, we found some of those. I mean, there were definitely isopods congregating around, and I wasn't for sure certain that my IDing was correct, but they looked like the canyon isopods to me, so it's kind of neat to see some isopods out there in the middle of the desert just at night, and it's pretty dry everywhere. So
yeah, there's actually a species too. There are several species out in the Southwest that are adapted, seem to be really well adapted. The Porcellio pruinosus, Porcellionides pruinosus, you can see out there sometimes. And my state, we're just right above Arizona, and part of the southwestern corner of the state is basically climatically the same as Arizona. There's the palm trees and everything, and I'll go herping down there. It's like 4 or 5 hours away from me, and drive down there from the cold weather into the warm weather. So cool. And it's kind of nice. And I've seen what looks like Porcellia laevis or maybe dilatatus, not sure exactly what it is, but I was reading in Oren's book about isopod zoology. He said that in that desert area there are what appear to be some very desert adapted laevis, Porcellia laevis. Okay. So I don't know if it's the same thing you saw or not, but I've seen them. And they do look a lot like dilatatus or laevis, but I didn't, take out a jeweler's loop and say, okay, let's check it out and see what it is. But
maybe that's what it was.
It could be the same thing going on. I'm not sure. But you find them right under dry rocks and stuff.
Yeah.
Show up. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of them were congregating around some sort of drain, which would make sense because there's probably some humidity there at least. But just going around with a flashlight in the complete darkness, and it's like, whoa, look at all these isopods. That's what I'm talking about. That's cool.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of surprising to see that.
For sure.
And Sammy wants to know if it's safe to pair zebras with other smaller isopods like dwarf whites, so that I can have my favorites plus a cleanup crew power boost in a vivarium.
So my response to that would be, although it happens by accident sometimes, I wouldn't recommend it, just because you sometimes run into you will run into competition, and over time you kind of end up with a situation where the more prolific species can outcompete the other one, right? So definitely in any scenario where you have dwarf whites in with other isopods, especially Armadillidium, they're going to reproduce way more quickly than the Armadillidium. Now, that being said, I have seen people say weird things where, like, keeping multiple species together, for some reason they found they did better, which is curious. I don't know why, but I'm sure there could be some interesting benefit. I do have dwarf whites that have gotten into a few of my cultures, probably just because they're so light in the Mankai somehow just like climb the plastic, or maybe from the drops or something. You have to be careful with that sort of thing, especially if you don't want like really competitive isopods getting into some rare ones enclosures. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend intentionally doing it, essentially. I have some cultures that are okay, and I'm just kind of careful, and I don't really like if the population of dwarf whites gets too crazy, I just try and pick out the original culture and move them into a new bin, which can be so hard to do, even because oftentimes if you're not careful, you're reseeding the dwarf whites in that one if you're not careful enough. But yeah, that's how I feel about it.
I totally agree. I think in almost all cases, you're going to get one species that outcompetes the other over time, and it might be a year and a half before it happens. It might be a long time, but it'll happen. Like in many cases, and I can't say I've never done all cases, so I can't say, but maybe if you have a vivarium with enough different niches, you could get something going on. Like you have like a 120-gallon vivarium, and you've got a drier, higher area where other isopods like it, and maybe you could get it to work. I don't know. But for example, in my leopard gecko enclosure, when I first seeded it with isopods, I think I put powder blues, zebras, and Costa Rican purples in it, with the idea that the Costa Rican purples would be down underground where it's more moist and doing their thing, and everybody else would be up top, and just kind of seeing what would happen. And that was 3 or 4 years ago. And for a year and a half, all the isopods seemed fine. Now the only thing you can find in there are Porcellanides pruinosus, and that's it.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely would have figured they'd be one of the ones to last, but maybe they were also predating the purples. Who knows?
Could be. Yeah. It's hard to say, but yeah, I think that you're going to get one that wins out because of the mutual exclusion principle in ecology. Basically, two individual species in the same niche, if there are limited resources, one's going to outcompete the other. It's just going to happen. Yep. So Levi wants to know how to salvage springtails in a substrate change with isopods.
Ooh. Well, I find, it's tough. Like a lot of people like to flood if it's like a culture of springtails, because they'll just float on the meniscus, but that's obviously not an option with a culture of isopods. I find that if you offer like a moist retreat, like a large flat piece of wood, a lot of columbola will just congregate on that, on the underside of it, and then you can just kind of tap them into the next place. And I actually have like a culture of, or I guess an enclosure that has quite a few different springtails that I kind of just keep off to the side and use to seed enclosures that way. It's just a lot of pieces of, I think, maple bark or something I have laying in there with some leaf litter, and I'll put some yeast and fish flake in there for the springtails, and that's what I do. They all really congregate under that wood, and then I just tap them. So if you're trying to salvage as many as you could, I think that just having something, a retreat that meets all their desires, if you will, for what their ideal environment is kind of the best way to do that. And it's not easy. Like, I know you, in your mind, you want to make sure everyone gets to go to the next bin, but it doesn't always work that well.
True. And I think that's a great point. you need to realize the reality with both isopods and springtails. Not all of them are going to do it, no matter how hard you try.
Yeah,
they're not going to make it all of them, but you can do your best, and you should. One thing that I've noticed too is that I rarely change out all the isopod substrate at once, because if you do, you're going to get the cycling again, and you don't really want that. So I'll change a third or a half of the substrate at a time, and then you get less of the cycling because you already have a robust population of springtails in the substrate that remains. You also have the microbial population, fungal population, all that sort of a balance. And so it tends to just carry that balance over. It's like, for those of you who keep aquariums, it's like moving the filter medium over, so you're carrying those beneficial bacteria colonies over. It's kind of the same idea, and it seems to work the same way.
Yeah, that's true. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I usually just I've done it different ways. Like, I sometimes will seed a new culture and take something over, or I try and like add new fresh material to the existing culture, but then you're going to run into a problem where it's just too much like substrate just in there. But yeah, it's tricky sometimes.
It is. And speaking of that, Fried Geppetto had a question about how you prepare bark and leaves for an isopod bin. Are you a baker or a freezer, or do you do something different?
Yeah, so I definitely don't bake them. With leaves, I honestly just wash leaves, if that. Now, okay, like I think there are things, sure, you have to watch out. You don't want to introduce like parasites or other invertebrates that'll prey on your cultures. But I don't really believe in like completely sanitizing everything to put into a culture. That's just kind of my take on it. I'm not trying to be lazy or anything, but I actually just think it doesn't make total sense to do that. Like, if something looks really dirty, or if I'm worried that there's like different invertebrates that are hiding in moss on a piece of wood or something, sure, I'll freeze it or something like that. But I don't want to remove the moss because that's a great food source for the culture, let's say. But I don't like people that'll suggest boiling and rinsing all their leaf litter. I don't personally agree with that. Like, I think rinsing is fine, but boiling, it just seems kind of unnecessary. Like, the animals naturally occur in this type of environment. They're not gonna like get sick. I mean, yeah, you can consider that they're coming from a different place or environment or whatever, but like, I think we overthink that process, if you know what I mean. I don't know. Like, I think the main purpose in doing any of that cleaning and such for me isn't because I'm worried about a pathogen or something like that. It's more so because I'm concerned that there's something hiding in there that'll prey on my isopods, or frankly, some other type of isopod that's going to outcompete them, just like we were discussing about before. But I've never had an issue with this, and that's just kind of how I've done it. And you see people discuss this in some of the isopod groups too. There's a bit of controversy with it, right? But I don't know. That's kind of just been how I do things. And I think there might even be some benefit to leaving some of that like organic matter intact too, for the animals to frolic through and consume, you know? You hear about different types of millipedes. This might be a stretch, but I've heard that, for example, there's those like pill millipedes, and I think there's a few species from Madagascar that have in the past been imported. And one of the hardest, or there's like some speculation that they don't do well because of something in their gut, that they I don't know if it's like the probiotics, or if, dare I say, in their gut with the lichens they consume, like they lose it from the stress and who knows what. So it's a bit of a stretch there, but I'm thinking, who knows, there might be some beneficial aspect to them just eating the raw, intact leaf litter, with the exception of some rinsing out. But, you know, you're boiling it, you're not just killing anything on it, you're removing tannins, all kinds of things. So
right,
yeah.
And I agree with the boiling. I never boil my leaves. And I think you're dumping a ton of nutrients away when you do that.
Well, yeah, for sure.
You have to be. And I'm not saying that it doesn't work for some people. I'm just saying I don't do it either. I'm on your side of the fence with that same thing. I do generally heat treat my leaves, but like you, I do it because I'm more concerned about introducing, say, predators or parasites like nematodes or something to the culture rather than pathogens specifically.
Mhm.
And so I do that, and that's partly because of how my permit works. I have to make sure that when I'm shipping isopods, that's all I'm shipping and stuff. So they're that kind of thing. But I totally get the idea, and I totally agree that many times when you just take some raw leaves that are collected from like a pesticide-free area, you're introducing a lot of beneficial things into your culture that way. Totally agree. Totally makes sense. And Sandy was asking about has about 40 zebras in a 12 by 16 container. Do they stay burrowed all the time? And I would say that goes back to what you were saying, the colonies, just the population needs to build, and then you'll see more of them.
Like I find some of the younger maculatum or the zebras will burrow themselves or bury themselves, but the adults tend to prefer hiding under wood and bark. I don't know if that's been your experience. Like I'll find very young monkai certainly are deep kind of in the substrate at times, but for me, I find that anything that's a bit larger is near the surface under debris. Yeah,
I would agree. And you might find them burrowed more when the colony's new, and then as soon as you get enough of them, they'll start showing up a lot more. And Brian wants to know more about cycling an isopod enclosure. Do you have any more to add to what we talked about already?
Is that something you want to touch on? Because I feel like you're more well-versed with that.
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about that. Basically, it's just the idea that when you put isopods in a new culture, what you're doing, considering that your substrate, and assuming that your substrate is new, including your base substrate, your leaves, your decor, all of that stuff is new, and that it's fairly sterile. And sterile is a stretch. It's not really sterile, but the variety of microbial population and of microfaunal population and everything is very limited when you put it in, when you start. And so you're starting with a partial vacuum. Basically, there's all these rich resources, all these nutrients in there, and you just put some isopods in, and hopefully springtails too. And when you do that, there aren't very many springtails and aren't very many isopods typically when you first do. And so there are all these nutrients just sitting there waiting for fungus, airborne bacteria, fungal spores, I should say, airborne bacteria, and other things like fungus gnats or mites or whatever to come in and take advantage of these almost unlimited nutrients in that small enclosure. We think of it as small, but to them it's this gigantic, treasure trove, cornucopia. And so they're coming in and starting to interact and utilize those nutrients. And as the isopods reproduce, as the springtails reproduce, as the microbial populations reproduce, they're going to start to balance things out. You'll find that mites and fungus gnats, as the springtails proliferate, the mites and fungus gnats are going to decrease. As the isopods increase too, they will tend to outcompete those things. But before you find that balance, you're going to get more fungus gnats, more mites, and issues like that to some degree at first. And I guess that's what I mean by cycling.
Oh, that definitely makes sense. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah,
Seems pretty thorough.
Chelsea wants to know if we have any tips on dairy cows.
Just trying to think. Well, I mean, for me, like I would say definitely making sure they have a lot of surface area, just because they're one of those species that really takes off. Definitely. And so just like, I think if you're preemptively giving them a lot of surface area, and by that I mean like creating hides and retreats like with wood and bark and stacking it, even egg carton, which I started using a little bit more, or like experimenting with. I wasn't really into it at first. I like to just use natural things, but thing about the egg carton is they can actually consume it too, because it's a wood byproduct, so to speak, or paper. So I found a lot of the isopods, if they'll break it down. So just different surface area options, so they can really have more space in limited space. That kind of helps long term. Obviously, lots of protein in their diet. So whether that's fish flake, dried fish, things like that, they really go nuts for it. And then also making sure to also offer some vegetation. That's important. I think it's easy to kind of forget to do that. I mean, it depends. Some isopods are really not as receptive to eating those sorts of food, I find, especially like Porcilio expansus, I find will like eat the skin off a lot of things, but doesn't want to do much more than that with some types of vegetable, like zucchini, for example. But sweet potato, different types of cabbage, Asian cabbage. I can't remember the name of it. There's one that they really like. Things like that. I think that really will set you up right. And then obviously decent amount of ventilation. They can tolerate humidity or more humidity, but they should have good airflow too.
Right. And they may not be that picky as far as a dry area, but they do need their ventilation, especially since, like you're saying, they reproduce so fast. They can overwhelm themselves if they don't get enough air.
They're quite literally the one that I was thinking of as an example of that individual that I guess made a post on Facebook saying their whole culture crashed because they just kind of came to it and there was all this condensation despite a few drilled holes in the lid. And everyone had basically just died from not enough airflow because the population got so big. There wasn't enough airflow. It's crazy to think that it can get that far, but yeah.
But they totally can, especially with something like dairy cows, which will breed crazily. Any tips on reducing fungus gnats in isopod and millipede bins?
For sure. I think the biggest thing with fungus gnats is you want to kind of attack them at their life stages. So I would suggest for the larva, it's tricky because you don't want to compromise the needs of the isopods and millipedes. But if you can safely reduce the level of moisture in the substrate, that can obviously make it less ideal and kill off maybe some of the larvae. And then the adults, just getting them because they're the reproductive stage with like sticky traps or something just above the enclosure. Like I'm not talking about the large ones, but just like, little gnat traps that are curled or whatever to catch some of the adult flies so they don't spread to other enclosures or keep breeding in that. I think that helps a lot. And then obviously just controlling how much food you're using too. I think with the gnats, like obviously there has to be nutritious substrate and such, but I think the humidity is a bigger part than having a little bit of leftover food. I don't find that that's really the issue with them. It's just like a nutrient-rich soil, and that's enough for them, right? That's why people get them in their plant pots. There's zucchini and dried fish sitting in a houseplant pot, but the fungus gnats are still there, depending on the situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think I love to use the sticky traps. I think they help a ton, just like you said. And one thing I've been experimenting with is different types of ventilation, like cross ventilation and stuff. Mm-hmm. I think it reduces the fungal smell some that they're attracted to. And I'm still experimenting with that, but I think there's something to be said for that. I know that I've talked about like mosquito bits that have the bacterial agents that control fungus gnats, and they do, but I'm a little concerned now, and I've talked about this in other videos, that it could have a long-term effect that's negative on the isopod colonies. I think it had a negative effect on my ivory millipede colonies over time. Like the first year it was fine, and then the second year it wasn't so fine. And I found an academic paper that sort of said that it does tend to reduce biodiversity of arthropods long-term, like second year and beyond. So
interesting.
I'll have to do some more research on that, but I don't know that I necessarily recommend mosquito bits as much as I might originally have done, just because there may be a long-term effect, but more research is needed, really.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't really know too much about that option. I mean, I know people will do things also like, I mean, it's not really worth mentioning because I don't think that would work with the isopods. Like I've heard like diatomaceous earth helps, but I imagine that would be harmful for the isopods too.
Right.
So probably not a good choice.
Yeah, it is a good natural control for things outside. Like if you have a shelf and you want to put some diatomaceous earth like around the isopod cultures, that might help and would certainly help with mites cross-contaminating and stuff. But yeah, and not necessarily in the cultures of the isopods. That could be a problem for sure. So Sandy wants to know what cross ventilation is.
I'm wondering if this is visible. Hopefully. So if you have your holes along the side to the opposite side, so you have your cross ventilation, and then this is the topper lid ventilation. I don't know.
That was perfect. I mean, it's a lot easier to see it. One picture is worth 1,000 words, and a short video clip like that is worth 1,000,000 words. So that's perfect.
Hopefully.
Wow, the time is going really fast. I know that.
Wow. Yeah.
I didn't realize. I don't want to keep you too long because that was longer than we had originally planned to go. But it's been awesome. But I don't know how much time you have. So
I mean, I have a little bit more time if there's a few last minute questions. I mean, I had originally planned to be talking till this time anyways. We had our little hiccup with the time. So,
That's true.
But it's not. It's actually. Sorry, I'm seeing here. Someone says it's 3 a.m. in Toronto. That is not correct. It is actually 9:30 p.m. 9:32 p.m. Chris is a comedian, I see.
That's true. That's true. So, theropod hunters, what's the youngest age for a kid to start a dairy cow culture? Good question. What do you think?
Well, I mean, that little story I shared of the family friends, again, the mother was very much involved, but if I'm not mistaken, their child was like 5 or 6. So I think with, with parental supervision and collaboration, I think, I mean, I'm a single individual. I don't have children, but I am a firm believer, someone who like cares a lot about the future generation, children, youth. I think that the opportunity to care for animals is a fantastic way to teach children about compassion and caring for others and living beings. So I think if parents are willing to be involved in that process and, make sure that your child is exercising cleanliness too with animals that are in like soil and such, right? Washing their hands and everything. I don't see why. I don't mean like, obviously a child that's capable of being careful with a small organism and maybe not handling and touching too much or anything, but why without their parents' help, I don't see why they couldn't learn about those types of animals like a 5 or 6 year old already.
Yeah.
Probably wouldn't start them with rubber duckies or anything. But
definitely not. Yeah, Chris says his 4-year-old daughter's helped with the isopods and has 2 of her own cultures now. So
yeah, there you go.
Makes sense. Yeah, and thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Morelia, for joining in. It looks like they're going, but love the chat, so that's great.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Mold outbreak in an isopod bin. This should probably be our last question, and after that, if you can stay on with me for just a second once we close out of the broadcast, just for a couple of minutes,
that would be
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So Fried Geppetto is wondering the best way to get rid of mold in an isopod bin. Would you remove the mold or move the isopods?
Sure. So if we're talking like a full-blown outbreak, I'm going to be honest. Like it depends on the type of mold, but like I find these spores, they're naturally occurring. You're going to find a lot of this in your substrate already. I mean, especially I've used certain commercial products that I've purchased. Sorry, there's people upstairs playing video games. I don't know if you guys hear that. You're wondering whether suddenly people yelling, but there's commercial products that right out of the bag with the right amount of moisture, like start producing different fruiting bodies like yellow mushrooms and things like that. So I think if you can systematically pick some of that out or stir it, it's actually not terrible, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of the isopods consume it. I don't like to let it get to a point where the spores are released everywhere and there's dusty like fungus. But I think the biggest thing is like ventilation and picking it out where you see it. If there's types of, or sorry, we're talking about mold. Okay, well, with like if it's kind of your, depending on the type of mold, some of that can be really harmful. Your manka can get stuck in it and stuff too, which is really dangerous. I'm thinking more of mushrooms. You should have just jumped in.
No, that's fine. It's all related, right?
Well, yeah, of course, yeah. But yeah, mold, I'd be more worried about. Like if it's really bad, I think it's definitely it's tricky because you might not be able to get all your isopods out in one attempt. So probably I'd modify the lid some way to increase the ventilation just right off the bat. And then I'd try to pick out as many adults or larger animals as I could, just continue to do that over a few days. Sort of the same way as we discussed with the springtails. If you have, I mean, you'd already have that set up, but I'm sure your isopods will always just congregate under some form of wood, and then makes it easier to gently put them in there, whether it's picking them off or minimizing handling. You might be able to even gently brush them off with a paintbrush, like a very gentle paintbrush, as opposed to trying to knock them off. You'll probably damage them. And then just that ventilation can hopefully assist the other ones while you haven't been able to pick them out yet, just to have more ventilation, be safer from that, because that's, generally speaking, that's the main reason to have that mold. Insufficient ventilation combined with too much humidity. So that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a couple of people, Ken and Chris, have mentioned lots of springtails will help too. So in addition to what you said, I love your suggestion of the paintbrush, because that is a really great way to move isopods, especially more sensitive ones like small juveniles or like soft-bodied ones like powder blues. You don't want to be picking those up with your fingers. So the paintbrush is a great way to deal with that kind of thing. And you starting out new with a lot of springtails is always a good way to get that working.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So thank you so much. It's been amazing. It's been great to meet you and talk to you, and everybody's been great joining in the chat. It's been a great live stream. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been really excited about this opportunity, and this is actually our first face-to-face online conversation too. So I was really looking forward to that and getting to talk about the little critters we love so much. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone who tuned in. It's really a great pleasure. And I see Chris there shouting me out. Thank you so much. It's very kind of you.
Yes, anyone who hasn't already subbed to Dian, just go ahead to Reptiliatus and do that. You won't regret it.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you all tuning in. It was a real pleasure to be here.
All right. And thank you, everybody.